So we do know that ground forces are headed to the region. There are 3,500 Marines and sailors that arrived yesterday. There are Marines from San Diego that should arrive in the next week or so, and there's a headquarters unit coming from the 82nd Airborne. What we don't know is what their specific mission is. That number, about 7,000 total, is certainly not enough to do any sort of major combat operation, but it may be enough to do some kind of specific mission, perhaps targeting one of the islands in the Strait of Hormuz. But either way, I think what we're seeing is a war that started out where the United States and Israel had the advantage in that they had the strongest weapons and the biggest capability. But the Iranians have adjusted by fighting asymmetrically. They're not depending on heavy weapons because they don't have them. Rather, they're using things like missiles and drones to conduct targeted strikes against U.S. allies and regional partners, such that they don't need to decisively win. They simply need to execute enough power to stay in place for another day. Whereas the United States and Israel are seeking to overwhelmingly defeat the Iranian military. So if you think about the war in Iraq, we saw this play out with IEDs, that the Iraqi insurgency stayed in the fight by launching IEDs and targeting troops. This time, that weapon of choice for the Iranians is largely drones. They're inexpensive, they're easy and cheap to make, and as long as Iran hasn't enough capability to make a few more, they stay in the fight.
Joumanna, I want to get your perspective on how this dovetails with what we've heard yesterday. We were talking about Gulf states kind of wondering about the role that the U.S. is going to play going forward, surprised by and disappointed by and worried by the strikes that we've seen over the course of the last 4 weeks. Would this be welcomed by states in the Gulf?
Look, chaos on their doorstep is never welcome, but at the same time, I think the rhetoric that's come through from Gulf leaders is that their patience is being tested. It is not unlimited. But I also think we need to make a distinction amongst the Gulf states. They don't act as a homogenous unit. And in the past couple of days, I think there's been a distinctive narrative that's emerging between, say, the likes of Qatar, who have reiterated that Iran will continue to be a neighbor of the country in the future, and that their preferred solution would be a diplomatic solution, versus the likes of, say, the UAE, who are turning a lot more vocal about the need for a solution that is beyond just a ceasefire, but a more sustainable political solution whereby Iran doesn't continue to pose what they see as a threat and economic terrorism over what they're doing with the Strait of Hormuz right now. So I think that's a very important point to emphasize. The second thing also is that if you think about where we were on Friday, there were talks about the potential for these negotiations, and President Trump indicated that perhaps the Iranian side were asking to talk to them. There's no indication in the last 24 hours that indeed such a meeting is going to take place. There is a meeting taking place in Pakistan today with foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, of Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan, but notably nobody from Iran, nobody from the United States. So to your point, I think the focus this weekend has really been on, one, what you were just talking about, the mobilization of that Marine Expeditionary Unit, the arrival of that unit to the region. And number two, we now have a new front in this war. Let's not forget that the Houthis have started striking at Israel. And that is not to be underplayed and understated, because it is perhaps coincidental that Iran have fired up this other front at a time where more troops out of the U.S. are being sent to the region at the same time.
Nancy, we had another unexpected player enter the chat this week, and that was Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, who went to the region. He's the first president to visit the region during this conflict, not from the area, and has come up with, has left with defense cooperation agreements with Saudi, UAE, and Qatar, because speaking of asymmetric warfare, obviously Ukraine has been pretty successful in shooting down, pushing back against quadrants of Russian drones coming into its capital cities. And Zelensky has said, look, we know how to do this. Let us help you. Is the hope here that he will then get help, financing, and support in the war against Russia later on from these same countries?
Yes, I mean, very simply, the Ukrainians have fought, in some cases, the very same drones in their own battlefield. And what they have is something very valued by the Gulf partners right now, which is the capability to combat that threat. And so I think the Ukrainian president is leveraging that skill that the Ukraine has uniquely developed over the last 4 years to provide more of the kinds of weapons that they need to really have battlefield gains inside Ukraine. For the Gulf partners right now, they're spending, in some cases, several $1 million to shoot down drones that are worth about $30,000. Ukraine offers an opportunity to close that gap. But for Ukraine, the Gulf partners have weapons and capabilities that they don't have and are no longer receiving from the United States. And so I think President Zelensky is treating this as an opportunity to expand his ability to combat threats from Russia by using the skill that Ukraine uniquely brings to the fight that the Gulf partners are facing from Tehran.
Joumanna, I want to ask you about the latest on the Strait of Hormuz, and we've seen a number of these kind of bilateral agreements between Iran and countries to which these ships are flagged, letting a few of them through. Secretary of State Marco Rubio addressed that in some comments on Friday that he gave on the tarmac. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
One of the immediate challenges we're going to face is an Iran that may decide that they want to set up a tolling system in the Straits of Hormuz. Not only is this illegal, it's unacceptable, it's dangerous to the world, and it's important that the world have a plan to confront it.
Talk a bit about this tolling system as the Secretary of State describes it. We heard the president make remarks similar to that when he was speaking in Miami at this conference that was tied to the Saudi Public Investment Fund. Clearly a lot of irritation on the U.S.'s part here, but how much is it actually working? Are other countries seeing this as a means by which they can get oil and other supplies out of that strait?
Well, certainly there have been a few exceptions, and I think the way we've described the Strait of Hormuz is it's effectively shut, but in reality, it's actually been effectively controlled by Iran, and they are making exceptions for certain Iranian-linked vessels. We reported last week on Bloomberg that they are submitting a draft bill in the Iranian parliament to propose setting up this toll, and also reported that in some cases, vessels were paying up to $2 million per voyage just to make the safe passage through. So they are making exceptions. I mean, even overnight, we heard of Pakistan saying that they have managed to secure the passage of 2 vessels per day. President Trump last week in that very long cabinet meeting also said that the present that the Iranians gave him was the secure passage of 10 ships through the strait. So effectively, where we are right now, where things stand, is Iran are making certain exceptions so long as what they say the vessels are linked to non-hostile countries or key buyers, like in the case of China and in Pakistan and other Southeast Asian countries. But clearly, this is a situation that is not acceptable to Gulf Arab states. It is not an acceptable outcome for pretty much any nation in the world for Iran to exercise the sovereignty. But from the Iranian perspective, it has emerged as a key point of leverage. And you don't have to go too far. The Speaker of the Parliament, Mr. Ghalibaf, who's been very vocal on social media, reposted a comment yesterday saying that the U.S.'s war objectives have now shifted towards solely reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, that's far-fetched rhetoric, but I think it does really just underscore how much leverage they think they have over that key choke point on energy flows and global supply flows, and they're not going to let it up easily. And it has become a focal point also heading into what could be discussions between the two sides. They're insisting that they have to maintain sovereignty over it.
Nancy, I want to ask you, because you heard Joumanna talking earlier about how the GCC countries are not a monolith, and some are dealing with this separate ways. We've seen Saudi and UAE be a little bit more out front. There's reporting that they want the U.S. to continue with this, to go after Iran and essentially finish the job. Some of the other countries are taking a different approach. But one of the things I thought that was interesting, at that same forum David was just talking about on Friday, President Trump talked about the Abraham Accords and said to the room that, oh, I would really like to get Saudi Arabia back into the Abraham Accords. Those were those agreements by which Middle Eastern nations were normalizing diplomatic relations with the U.S. Saudi was supposed to be next in that list. Given everything that has happened between Israel and Gaza and now this conflict, is that at all possible at this point? Do you think normalization will continue, or do you think that's untenable given the politics of this moment?
I think Saudi Arabia has a more immediate concern, which is their neighbor could not only survive as a regime, but become more hostile to Saudi Arabia, to its economic interests, to its security for a sustained period of time. And so I think if you're Saudi Arabia right now, the concern is immediate and about security. What happens if the war ends in such a way in which the regime is still in power, or conversely, if it goes on for months in some sort of stalemate or in some sort of low intensity conflict for a sustained period of time? So I think what Saudi Arabia is looking at potentially is ways to protect itself from future threats from Iran, rather than looking for a reset in terms of its relationship with Israel broadly. Now, that doesn't mean that it's off the table entirely, but I think right now the war has shifted the security state of Saudi Arabia. It has shifted its economic power, and those things have to be addressed with first before we talk about something along the lines of the Abraham Accords.
Joumanna, very quickly, we have about a minute left. You mentioned the Houthis getting involved in this conflict, and there's been this kind of tenuous truce between them and the Saudis now for several years. Any indication that's likely to fray? How likely is that to stay in place and hold?
I think, as you say, it's tenuous, but let me just remind viewers that a truce was actually agreed to between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis back in 2022. Another truce was also agreed between the U.S. and Houthis, I should say, back in 2025. And the Houthis have actually refrained from attacking ships on Bab el-Mandeb and on the Red Sea since the Gaza-Israel ceasefire of October 2025. Now, the question is, obviously, given they've now entered back into the war in solidarity with Iran, they are saying that they're just going to be targeting their strikes at Israel. The big question is whether they're going to look to disrupt shipping again. For the time being, there are no signs of that happening. And actually, a spokesperson for Houthi yesterday, as reported by Al Jazeera, suggested that they will only be targeting Israel in this instance and plan to stick to the truce with the U.S. But again, we have to see how this all plays out and whether, if ground combat involvement would actually incentivize them to start acting and disrupting shipping on the Red Sea.
Certainly a new chapter.